Good morning. My name is Doug Anderson, and Micah has asked me to speak on the next in our series of 1 Corinthians. And so today I will be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 31, and then we'll jump ahead to chapter 3, 18 to 23. So you can get that ready at some point if you want to follow along. So I want to start by asking you, how would you like to have it all? Really, how would you like to have it all? I don't mean the cheesy all of trinkets and fame, but a deep, full life, a life of maturity and love, whatever the circumstances. What would it be like to have it all, right? I was recently talking with a friend of mine. He's a pastor at a church in Vancouver, and he was telling me about his church, which right now does not seem to have it all. Church these days, he was saying, he feels that his church is immature, that there's no accountability, that there's little discipline. There's even a lawsuit going on. Yes, someone is actually suing someone else in the church. There are a number of moral issues, and the usual challenges of marriage and divorce are there. They're struggling with the issues of and the people of other faiths. And what even is the gospel? How to understand that? The church has internal conflicts about their style of worship and who has the most important spiritual gifts. They also have practical struggles, how to deal with the poor, with money, etc., etc. Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at the wrong notes. That's the church in Corinth. I messed up. Sorry. My friend's church, it's doing great. I was looking at the wrong notes there. The church in Corinth was a bit of a mess. And for us reading this, it might come as a bit of a surprise. But perhaps this is good news. Have you ever been disappointed with church? Take heart. Lower your expectations. The early church was no class act. The point I'm making with the sledgehammer is that it is quite believable that a church today would have many or all of those problems. And there are lots of challenges in and facing the church these days. We can relate to the Corinthian church. They're kind of like us. So what about Corinth? What was the city like at the time of Paul? Well, it was a Roman-built, newly built city. It was a planned city, so it was stately and organized. It was a leading center of trade, agriculture, industry, and the arts. It was a multicultural city as people from all over the known world ended up in these empire cities. And of course, being a Roman city, it had the heritage of the classical world, the philosophy, literature, politics, and arts from ancient Greece. This was not, however, a conservative city. It had the reputation as quite the party city, as Corinth was also home to the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of carnal pleasures. Perhaps it was something like the magnet of London combined with the class and seediness of Paris, with a bit of the riskiness of Las Vegas and some Amsterdam thrown in. Maybe a lot of Amsterdam thrown in. I think it's fair to say that this was a culture that explored everything in thought, word, and deed. Maybe like Oxford University students on a spring break carnival cruise. It would help me if you laughed a little louder, actually. Point is, before we get too judgy, I think Paul and the Corinthians had their work cut out for them. So we can relate to the church, and I think we can relate our modern world to Corinth. Couple thoughts about reading this text. It's important that we try to understand the setting, the circumstances, and the people involved in this letter. It's important to engage our minds. But we Christians also believe that the Word is a living Word. For all its humanness, it is inspired by God. And that same Spirit that inspired Paul in writing this is the same Spirit that speaks to us as we read. It struck me as I was preparing this that here we have a similar church, a similar world, and we have the same letter. And the fun and frightening thing about studying the Bible is that as we read it, not just with our minds, but with open hearts and spirits, it begins to read us. As has been said, when we examine Jesus, soon we find that he is examining us. So while I do hope that I say something helpful today, even more I believe that God has something for you in this passage, whether communicated by me or not. So let's turn to our reading. At the beginning of chapter 1, Paul has been making an appeal for unity in the Corinthian church. People were choosing their favorites, their favorite leaders. Some choosing Paul, others Apollos, others Cephas, who is known as Peter. And so starting in verse 18 in chapter 1. For the message of foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. So here we have a culture that has inherited classical philosophy, among other things, and they really valued wisdom. Thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, were people who spent a lot of time thinking about and wrestling with what is true. What can we know, how to live, and how to get along politically. The questions they asked then are the questions still being asked about our world today. In the face of their significant triumphs in thought, the cross makes no sense. The cross doesn't seem to answer the particular questions they asked. They were trying to approach truth and meaning with their minds. And I don't think Paul here is being anti-intellectual. I think the point is to recognize the uses and limits of human intelligence. As Paul says in 21, the world through its wisdom did not know him, meaning God. Also, humility is not always a natural pairing with intelligence, and trusting oneself too far has been the downfall of many. The life of the mind is important, but it is not the fullness of life. The road to God is not found in a secret society of the super smart, right? For these folks, a Savior who dies did not compute. It was just talking through your hat. It didn't make any sense for the Greeks in Corinth. Paul continues in 22. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. So we've established that the Greeks thought that the cross was foolish, but not just that. Even many of the Jewish people, Jesus and Paul's people, couldn't bridge this gap. The Jews had been watching for a Messiah, warrior king to overthrow Rome. They had spent millennia learning about God, this powerful creator, the one who had saved them in the Exodus, a story they retold annually at Passover. They were looking for power, for a sign that God was really going to do it this time. So how could God or even his representative end up on a cross, that Roman means of execution? It made no sense. Isn't that going backwards? The cross speaks of captivity, not freedom. They couldn't get to faith in Jesus. The cross was a stumbling block. They also went to great lengths to be good. Law upon law was established to remind them that God is holy and good and that we aren't. Yet by following all the laws, one might in some sense gain his favor. You should be a stickler on every point, right? The Pharisees excelled at this approach. The cross was a scandal. How can you just be forgiven? It was a scandal of grace. So what do wisdom, power, and goodness look like in our world today? Perhaps that Greek perspective on wisdom is seen in people for whom science is the way to truth. For many today, science is the only way to answer questions. And in fact, if a question can be answered by science, to them it's not likely an important question. The intellectual trajectory of the Greeks resulted in people like the French scholar and scientist Laplace, who when asked about God said, "I have no need of that hypothesis." The success of science in providing explanations about the world has helped bring our culture to a place where there's no agreed upon truth besides scientific facts, which change regularly, although now the authority of science itself is being challenged. It also means that because science hasn't discovered meaning in life is really what you create. It's simply preferences. It's your choices. Meaning can be hard to come by in this life. In a world that has outgrown God, you have full freedom, but no clear direction. Maybe that is why God chose to express love in the foolishness of the cross rather than in an intellectual debate. The Jews were looking for power, for a sign of authority. When it comes to power, our modern world certainly has a great deal of experience with military power, political power, technological power, right? And also social power. To give up power is a stumbling block. There seems to be no end to the exertion of power one over another. Maybe this is why God chose to express love in the weakness of the cross rather than in the power of an army. What about this desire for goodness, for moral superiority? Today's social activism is a very dynamic phenomenon, but it's very important that you are on the correct side. Today's goodness has an edge. If one day you end up on the wrong side of an issue, the next day you may be cancelled, right? Cancel culture happens when usually a celebrity or well-known person is suddenly shut out and rejected for being on the wrong side of a political or social issue or has done something wrong. Social media punishes while sales and contracts are stopped cold. In our world, you are forced to pick a side, so choose wisely. Has there ever been a time with as much scapegoating, moral indignation, and lack of forgiveness? Probably. Human history seems to be full of such. Ours is just a modern version of it. But maybe this is why God chose to express love in the humiliation of the cross rather than in moral rule-keeping. Today the world is becoming increasingly complex and full of serious issues. As Christians, how we navigate these and live these out is very important. I doubt we can do it on our own. As Paul has said, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. We keep seeing that the gospel, this cross foolishness, is upside down. I've been thinking about how to understand this idea of how God's foolishness can be more wise than our wisdom. I think we have little windows in this when we say things like that quote from the Robert Burns poem, "The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry," right? Or, "I was going to do this, but then life had other plans." Maybe our control is not what we think it is. Or maybe the way we think about or refer to Mother Nature, right? We build our houses, we build our cities, and then we see a tornado or a mudslide, a forest fire, a tsunami, a hurricane, something, lay it to waste. What had been homes are now matchsticks strewn about. Suffering enters our world very tangibly in those moments and reminds us of the foolishness of thinking that we have everything in our power. Mother Nature, they say, shows us who really has the power. Don't fool with Mother Nature. How much more so the creator of the universe? God's foolishness being more wise than our wisdom implies not just that we are not in as much control as we think we are, but also that God works in ways that undermine the way we use wisdom and power and goodness for our own ends. The foolishness of the cross says no to know-it-all knowledge. The cross says no to worldly power and constant manipulation. The cross says no to scapegoating. People are to be redeemed, not cancelled. How does the world see us Christians? Are we being drawn into endless arguments, or are we living a deeper wisdom? Do we crave power and control like everyone else? Or do we have our hands open, ready to serve? Are we moral policemen, making sure everyone follows the rules, even if we don't necessarily keep them? Or do we express the goodness of our faith in selfless love? Do we laugh at people who express a goodness that makes them look a little foolish? Given the challenges our world is facing, it seems to me that we Christians have the choice of being seen as fools or hypocrites. Pick a side. Paul pushes his point home further in 26. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. Wow, says Paul, you are not so special. Remember, this whole section has begun with people bragging about the team they were on. The great theologian and writer John Stott apparently was being introduced at a talk he was giving, and I guess it was one of those very thick introductions that described the many books he had written, his wonderful characteristics, his great contribution to theology, and basically went on and on about his wonderfulness. When he got up, I guess maybe he was just sick of it all, and he said, that kind of introduction actually makes me uncomfortable. If you could read my mind, you would spit on me. Paul continues in verse 30. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, him, God, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is, our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Wisdom, righteousness, holiness, and redemption. That's what we need. But it is God who transforms us in Jesus to be these things. The scandal of grace once again. We can't do it ourselves, so stop bragging. This hits close to home for me. If you know me, you may or may not have heard me actually brag before, but I can assure you that I feel myself constantly on the lookout, making sure that I get credit for whatever I can. I could blame it on being a middle child seeking attention, but really it's just because I'm weak and frail and needy. Paul is saying, stop bragging, stop fighting, stop. So we're going to move ahead to chapter 3, verse 18. Do not deceive yourselves. If any of you think you are wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. For the wisdom of the world is foolishness in God's sight. And as it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. So then, no more boasting about human leaders. You see, God knows that our selfish motivations are always intertwined with our supposed wisdom and control and goodness. That's why they're ultimately futile. Paul says, you are not so wise or powerful when you were called to Jesus. Why are you so hungry for it now? You might hang out with the Greeks a little bit, but you're not as smart as they are. And you're not as welcome among the Jews anymore. You have to stick together. You have to stick to the gospel or you will get swallowed alive. No more boasting about human wisdom and power, Paul says. No more boasting about Paul or Apollos or Peter or John Stott. Now listen to this. How would you like to have it all? Verse 21, the second half of 21. All things are yours. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are of Christ and Christ is of God. This reminded me of the prodigal son, the parable of the lost sons. And when the rebel son returns home to be welcomed by his gracious father, the older one complains. But the father says to him, you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. It would be good to spend some time thinking about what all are yours means. With regard to our leaders, any of God's good gifts that come through them are ours. And the world, any of God's good gifts that come to us through the world are ours. And so in life, and what about death? What are the good gifts that actually come to us from God in death and dying? And the present and the future. These days there's a lot of fear about the future and death. As Christians, what hope do we have in the face of such? We will see later in this letter that Paul will talk about the resurrection and its importance. But at this point, we are left sitting at the foot of the cross, looking up at a dying Jesus. It's a good place to start. Now more than ever, we see that in our world there is suffering. Human wisdom, power, and goodness, for all the value that they have in some ways, are also self-protective fortresses that end up as matchsticks strewn about. It is the cross that somehow connects earth and heaven, right? Soil and sky. It may seem foolish, it may be a stumbling block, and yet its mystery and love is the deepest truth there is. In closing, I just want to share a short story. In March break this year, Jackie and I flew out for a long-awaited visit with our daughter and son-in-law in Ottawa. But due to the pandemic, within 3 or 4 days of our arrival, the restaurants were all closed, all the heritage sites and museums were shut down. Nothing being opened, we pretty much walked the abandoned streets of our capital, going between our hotel room and their apartment. Any place that we travel to, we like to go and visit the churches. And at this early date in the pandemic, we did find a Catholic church that was open, so we stepped inside. We quietly made our way, looking at the paintings and the statuary, looked at the Stations of the Cross, and I found myself fall into prayer. You'll remember that March was a different time. We were watching Italy fall apart. In those first few days, I'd spent a lot of time on the phone, despite being on holiday, with colleagues at work, trying to plan how our clinic would cope with the pandemic. I didn't know what I was coming back to, both at my work in the clinic and in the hospital, how much risk there was going to be, so on. I was thinking also about a friend of ours who was dying of cancer, and in fact would be dead in a few weeks. And I was thinking about struggles in our own family. You know, parents are always worried about their kids. I could feel all this on my shoulders as I struggled with God in my praying. And as I moved up to the front rail towards a life-size painted wooden sculpture of Jesus on the cross, I was praying now at the rail with my head down, eyes closed. I was praying, why? Why, God, does there have to be so much suffering and trouble? Why this way? As I finished my question, I found myself looking up, and there was Jesus on the cross, broken, bloodied, dying, maybe dead. And in the moment, I was reminding that suffering is a mystery, but it is not meaningless. If there is nothing spiritual in this world, nothing beyond the physical machinery of this life, suffering is meaningless. All the strewn matchsticks of our lives, all the tears, all the injustices, ultimately they don't mean anything. But here on the cross is a God who, in love, mysteriously came to join us in suffering, to ease suffering, and in the end will heal our suffering. We preach Christ crucified. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Peter or the world or life or death or the present or the future. All are yours, and you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. Amen.